railroad running through the Doing land. As a child, I knew that an old railroad bed ran the whole length of our woods, coming in at the east end of Lake Carmine, then Franklin Pond, and continuing on the east side of the lake. There were stone cattle passes through which we could walk, left for the cattle to go through to the lake to drink. These have long since fallen, but there is one still intact on Wilfred Rainville's swamp farm. The roadbed has been used ever since for gathering sap and as a camp road for the cottages on the Doing and Hammond shore. A news article not many years ago, entitled "The Railroad That Was Not," stated a few facts about the road that I never knew. In 1882, trains came in from Farnham, Quebec, by way of Stanbridge East to Phillipsburg, Quebec. A group of businessmen, headed by Bradley Barlow of St. Albans, decided that it would be advantageous to connect the St. Johnsbury and Lake Champlain Railroad from Sheldon Junction with the Canadian line. Thus, the Canadian Junction Railroad was formed and work started. Grading was completed all of the way. A station was built at East Franklin, and rails were laid from Phillipsburg to East Franklin, up to, but not across the river. For 1 week, there were excursions from East Franklin to Montreal. Catherine Dewin's mother, Nellie Noble, went on the Montreal excursion one day, and my father, Charles Dewin, rode as far as Phillipsburg. Then, as the volume of passengers was too low to warrant continuing, train service from Farnham to Phillipsburg was discontinued, and the roadbed in the Sheldon-Franklin area leased for 99 years. The rails were taken up and carted away by horse-drawn wagons. My father and his older brother Henry were two of the people hired to draw off the rails. He didn't know what became of them, but he thought they were buried. The roadbed is still used for the camp road.
Thank you very much, Miss Doing. My grandfather, Dolph Doing, he's going to tell us about farming when he was a boy.
50 or 60 years ago, farming was a little different than today. Most farmers made little milk in the winter. Milking was done by hand. Milk was separated mostly by hand with a separator, or some had a horsepower to turn the separator. Skim milk was fed to hogs and calves. The farmers used to use a three-legged stool to sit on while milking. Anyone that could milk 10 cows an hour was considered a good milker. And later farmers started selling milk and had to put it in a tank of cans in a tank of ice water. And had to, as soon as the ice was thick enough on the lake or river, they had to cut the ice by hand, draw it with the horses, and store it in the ice house, pack it in sawdust. And all the cattle had to be turned out to water every day. The manure was kept in the barn mostly until they had a few mild days so they could draw it out the field and spread it with the horses. The main crop besides hay was corn and oats. Most farmers raised their own potatoes and had their own garden. Hay was cut by hand at first, and then later they had a horse mowing machine. And they had a rake by a dump rake, had to be tumbled and pitched on. Then came the hay loader and hay fork, which was quite a labor saver. The oats were thrashed with a thrashing machine, which was powered by two horses on a horsepower. Later they used a gasoline engine. sugar was sold mostly in 1 or 2 pound cakes, or was put in 20-pound tubs to be sold later. Good share of the winter was spent cutting wood. The wood had to be split and stored in the shed during the summer for next winter's use. Also had to cut the sugar wood for the next year's sugaring.
Thank you very much, Grandpa. This is Mrs. Martha Toll, who's going to tell her experiences with rural schools.
Is it running?
Well, I guess my experiences with rural schools are many. Before I talk about the schools that I taught in, though, I want to tell about the town schools. In the town of Franklin, at one time, there were 12 one-room rural schools. And I said that wherever a few families of English people settled, the first thing they did was to build a school. And then if there was enough of them in that area, they built a church. And in our town, this is almost true. We had schools all over the town. Where there were probably 6 or 8 or 10 families to support a rural school and send children there. They built a school. And there are 3 of the old rural schools still standing, and the 3 have been converted into homes or summer places. One is the Hammond School, and the Thomas Boyles of Montreal own that. And another one is the Hubbard School, and Jean Dempster of Montreal owns that. And another one is the South Franklin School, and Teresa Larrabee, and what's her husband's name? Teresa and Arthur Larrabee own that, and they have a family, and they live there, and they've converted it into quite a decent home. There was no water there, but they have got a well, so they're quite comfortable. These other places, oh yes, and the East Franklin School is another one that was converted into a very good home. The Barabee sisters own that, and they would like to sell that. Well, what I was about to say is wherever there was a few people got together, they built a school, and then if there was enough, they built a church. And in our town, there was a church at Brown's Corner, one at East Franklin, one at South Franklin, and 3, no less, in Franklin Center. So we were well represented as to churches and schools. My mother taught in the Franklin Rural Schools, and I taught in the Franklin Rural Schools, and I'm sure from around 1880 when my mother taught until 1925, I'll say, when I began to teach, those schoolhouses hadn't changed at all. Some of them had been closed, however, but I went into one here at Brown's Corner, and I'm sure that there'd been no improvements. Well, I'll take that back. There was one improvement. They had put in jacketed... No, they didn't. They put the jacketed stove in after I was there. And anyway, life was rugged if you taught in a rural school. Now, that ends my discussion for this part on rural schools in Franklin. I want to tell you about the first rural school I had. When I graduated from high school, of course, that was in the good old days when you had to have $1 million or you didn't go to college, and my folks didn't have any money, and I didn't have any money, so there was no hope for me to go to college. So my father was school director in Highgate, and there occurred a vacancy out in the what they call the Carmen neighborhood, and that's, incidentally, it's on the way from Highgate Center to St. Armand, and kind of in a no-man's land. So I had the school. I was 17 years old. It was one of the poorest neighborhoods in the town. There were a few Canadian French families that were solvent, and their children had what they should have to go to school. They had decent clothes and a decent lunch. And then there were several families who were very poor and didn't have what they should have to go to school. And I didn't have so much sympathy for those children then as I do now. I was 17 years old, and I didn't know very much. I'd been brought up fairly sheltered, and I went into a school where these children had impetigo and runny noses and no clothes, not proper clothes, and no good lunches. And instead of my going home and tearing up one of my mother's sheets and taking it to school and say, "Here, my dear
please wipe your nose. I tried to ignore it, and I wish I could live that over again. And I didn't know anything about impetigo treatments, and so the poor darlings had impetigo. And it was a neighborhood where the kids didn't have too much Christmas, and I'm sure that some of them almost never had an orange. But anyway, at Christmas time I made candy bags, and everybody had an orange, and we had a Christmas party. And don't think that vandalism is entirely contained in this age. There was a case of vandalism there after I'd been there a month or two. Somebody broke into the schoolhouse, and they raked the ashes out on the floor, and they tried to tip the stove over, and they threw the books around and wrote obscenities on the blackboards. And there was some investigation as to who had done it, but it was never decided, I guess. Anyway, it was dropped. But that didn't scare me any. I kept on anyway. I readied the schoolhouse around, swept the mess up, and went back at it. I think I had around 20 or 25 students, and as you may guess, from a neighborhood that was totally rural and quite poverty-stricken. They were not top-grade students. I had some nice little kiddos out of the French-Canadian families, and I boarded in one of the French-Canadian families when I stayed there. And I've said this many times. I probably shouldn't say this so it gets into print, but it's a joke. I've got to tell a joke now. I said, everybody that teaches school hopes that they have taught a president or a United States senator or maybe a governor or at the least a town representative. And I wasn't that lucky, but one of mine made it to the top. He ended up in state's prison. And, well, I hope they had some pleasant things to remember me by, and I will always remember that as a hard time of my life. And incidentally, I boarded in Highgate Center, and I drove a team to that school, and it was about 3 miles, and the mud was hub-deep some of the time. I'll tell you, that was an experience that I won't forget for a while. The schoolhouse still stands, and a dear little descendant of a French-Canadian lives there with her husband. There was no water, and of course no flush toilets. There were outhouses. There wasn't even chemical toilets. But we didn't suffer very much from that, it seems to me. But the kids were kind of rough, and they did smoke on school grounds, which I didn't object to. And I remember I trounced one young one out for that. But they were all pretty good kids, and I had fun with them. I was young, and they were young, and I didn't know very much. And if I had it to live over again, I'd do it better. Then I came home. I got through that year anyway, and I don't think I taught them very much, but I hope I taught them a little fun. And I thought I never would teach school again. I found it so very hard. Oh, there were some experiences I didn't tell about, too, when I boarded in our French-Canadian family. They were real old French-Canadians, and they butchered a pig, and the children came to school, and they were all excited because today we were going to butcher at our house. And the schoolhouse was behind a big hill from where the family lived, and by and by we saw smoke circling around up in the air, and the kids said, oh, they must be singeing the pig now. And I said, what do you mean by that? So they said, well, when we singe our pig, we get out a big pile of straw and kill the pig and lay him in the straw and set the straw afire, and that takes his bristles off. So anyway, well, that's what they did, and I had some of it to eat, and it wasn't too bad. And mother was a schemer in that family. Well, anyway, she made me nice lunches. She roasted the nicest part of the pork and set it in the parlor and covered it up, and I had it in my sandwiches. I don't know what the kids had. Perhaps they had good too, but I remember she did that for me. And she made pancakes on the top of the stove, and they were as big as a pie plate, and we had pancakes and syrup. They made syrup. Well, she was a good old gal. There was one thing I'd like to tell you about her, and you probably know this too. She was one of the few people that I met in my lifetime that carded her own wool and washed it and spun it, and she knit mittens and socks for her family, and she wove sheets and made rugs besides. And I have seen that mother in the evening sitting in her rocking chair knitting, and I know she was fast asleep, and this is as true as I sit here. So after that, I thought, well, I never shall teach school again. So I came home, and I stayed home a year, and I guess I didn't do much of anything. So the next year I thought, well, I guess I need to have a player piano, so I'm going to do something. I'll go to Swanton Teachers Training, and I'll get a job and buy a player piano. So I went to Swanton Teachers Training, and I had a good time there. We played basketball some, and it was basketball probably like what you never saw. And we wore bloomers to play in. I guess the girls, I've got a picture somewhere that shows that basketball team. I guess the girls would laugh if they'd see what we wore then. And we never won many games, but we had a good time. So, well, if I do say so, I was one of the smarter ones in the class anyway. And then I remember we had an exam in our class, and the teacher left us on her honor. So she went out of the room, and presently she came back all afire. She said, I looked through there, and I saw all you girls talking. What in the world were you talking about? And I didn't say anything, and the others didn't say much. And she said, Martha, what were you talking about? Well, I said, I hate to tell you. Well, I want to know. And I said, well, some of the girls asked me what the answers was to that question, and I told them. She said, if there's anybody in this room that put something down on that paper that wasn't their own knowledge and opinion, I want you to take it straight off. And I don't think anybody got a very good mark out of that test. Well, anyway, she taught us a little something about artwork, and that you ought to have a daily schedule, and some things I didn't know. So right off, I got a school at Brown's Corner down here where the schoolhouse stands falling to pieces, and I felt bad about that too. And we still had no indoor toilets. We still had no toilet facilities, and we still walked half a mile for the water. But it was one of the happiest times of my life there, and I had a good school, and we had, I guess the blackboards might have been oilcloth, but you could write on them. I think we had one good one. And I played with the kids, and we skated down to Brown's Corner, and all in all, it was a happy time. And I think with the centralization of school the way it is, that some very good things have been lost. The older children that were more capable helped the younger ones, and I was glad to see a lot of things change, like the children don't go to school without a proper lunch, and if they need to have clothes, that somebody gets them clothes. And I'm glad to see all that change, but there are some things about the old ways that were right after all. Oh yes, the girls wanted to know about my salary. My salary really wasn't too bad. I got $17 a week in Highgate, and I paid $5 for board, and I had no Social Security or hospitalization. I was never sick. I didn't need that. And or any income taxes taken out of it, and I didn't have to register a car or buy gasoline for it. My horse provided my transportation. But it was, I will say this, it's much easier today than it was then. And when I taught in Franklin, I think I got $18 the first year, but I boarded at home. And maybe I got $19, and when I went to Franklin Center, I got $22. And from the time I was a little girl to the time I taught in Franklin Center, that schoolhouse hadn't changed one bit, except to get older. And I think by the time my children went to Franklin Center, it had changed very little. And then during that period when they were there at school, I built on an addition. And I have thought that teachers then worked a lot harder than they do now. I've had 30 pupils in a rural school, and I'm sure I had 30 or maybe 35 in 4 grades at Franklin, and I'm sure that some of the people that went to school to me can tell you that they learned something going to school to me, and that was Philip Pierce, one of them. I'll tell you what he learned. This is all funny too. He said one day, I guess Miss Hannah was cross that day. He said we had Central America, and we came to class, and we were supposed to have learned the countries of Central America, and nobody could name them. And she said, all right, stay after school and learn the countries of Central America. So he said we stayed after school, and I learned the countries of Central America, and I never forgot them. Is it ready? There's one other thing I'd like to say about rural schools. the farther away you got from villages and farther into the country you got, the worse the attendance was. When that school I taught in Highgate, some days I think perhaps I didn't have more than 3, and I went to school one day, I'm sure, when there wasn't anybody there at all, and that was probably around Halloween, and everybody took a church holiday, whether they went to church or not. And the nearer you got to the big schools, the better the attendance was. At Brown's Corner, my attendance was good, and at Franklin Center, it was very good. And I've found this to be true everywhere that I've known of rural schools.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Toll. Ms. May Gates is going to tell us about the log cabin from Franklin.
Am I talking about that?
The square log cabin, home of the Franklin Historical Society, was moved to its present site in the village from the dirt road to East Highgate. It was situated near the old Rickford apple orchard. In 1959, the 350th anniversary of Samuel de Champlain's arrival on territory now Vermont was celebrated. In that year, the Historical Society came into existence, and a week-long series of events took place. The cabin was fumigated by Ray Heflin, who barely got out of the cabin alive. Then the moving took place. When off its foundation, the cellar was discovered full of copper-colored snakes. Ray saw them and felt that they were very evil-looking. Harrison Wright, with his big machine, moved it to Franklin on skids. They were almost defeated coming up Magnet's Hill. When the load arrived on Highgate Street, it left the imprint of the skids in the newly blacktopped road. We heard, in no uncertain terms, from the state about that. We were reprimanded. While coming up Main Street, the chimney had to be removed to avoid the wires. The cabin itself is of huge squared logs, the marks of the axe clearly visible. This last summer it was all rechinked. The roof is metal. This was a modern repair job. It should, of course, be wooden shakes. The inside is plastered with house and door window frames. When moving it from Highgate Road, the plaster was cracked and shattered, so new plaster had to be put on. Also, the old plank floorboards were ruined, and a new softwood board floor had to be laid. The ceilings downstairs were also redone by someone, made of narrow matched boards, which is incongruous for a log cabin. The upstairs is a loft showing the huge hand-hewn sills. Downstairs there are 3 rooms. Originally, the big room was a kitchen with a cook stove. One little room is a bedroom and the other a parlor. The cabin was built in the 1800s by a Mr. Macy, whose family lived there. It has always been a home for some family, and a very cozy little home, too. Just before we acquired it, Dr. Judd of Eansburg had bought it and planned to move it to their farm for a guest house. When he found we wanted it for an historic building, he very graciously sold it back to us. The cabin is a perfect example of an old-time skill, all hand-hewn, the logs squared by hand, and the corners dovetailed and so tightly put together it is as square as it ever was. I guess I just read it all. I wrote some.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gates. This is Mr. Aldridge Pierce. He's going to tell us about his activities during his youth.
Okay, I shall tell you about some of the times when we used to slide with our bobbies up on the long hill. We used to start up what is presently now Clark Hubbard's, and we would get on our bobbies there and slide way through to the schoolhouse or the Catholic church. And we used to have, there was usually about 3 sets of bobbies. Morris Benjamin had a set, we had a set, and Lawrence Harrison had a set. And one time, Phil was up there. It was a beautiful night to slide. And at that night, they were having some play rehearsal at May Gates. And after the play rehearsal, all the people that were in the rehearsal wanted to take a ride. And so Ray Heflin, and there was Lynn Tatro, and Lorraine Willard at that time, and now she's Lorraine Toll, where some of them were riding. But anyway, Phil was far overloaded, and got that part way down, and it's so overloaded he couldn't steer it. And as he was, so not being able to steer it, he tipped over just about halfway down. And of course everybody frantically tried to get out of the way so that, because they knew another set of bobbies coming right off and somebody would get hurt. Well, during that time, it seems that Ray Heflin lost his false teeth, Lynn Tatro lost his rubbers, and but they got out of the way just in time before the other set of bobbies came down through. This bobby, which was a sled in front and another sled in back with a long board on the tying the two sleds together, and it had round runners so that it wouldn't slide on the ice. Now I'll tell you about the experience when we were boys and we used to gather sap. There used to be, brother and I used to be the two that gathered the sap, and my older brother was the one who did the boiling. And the bull, we had him hitched to a sled in shafts with the collar upside down and the hames upside down, because a bull has to draw from the top instead of the bottom. And we used to get the tub loaded, and in some cases the bull couldn't draw it. And we used to have a long rope that was hitched to the sled, and my brother would hitch on to pull that, and it used to be enough with my using the stick on the bull and my brother once in a while to go over the rough spots. Another thing that we used to do when we were boys, we used to play basketball. And we didn't have room for to hang our baskets up, so we used to take a bran sack and tie it very tight and hang pails at each end of a tool shed, roughly, so we had to shoot to get them, shoot it into the basket. And then we'd join sides, but there's no dribbling because, of course, our ball wouldn't bounce. But we would pass back and forth by having two different teams, and that's where we used to play basketball. Another sugar operation I had was my younger brother used to do a lot of boiling, and a local boy from Franklin, Sammy Green, used to come down. And it so happened they were a little short of wood, and they had a lot of tar paper that came off from a building. And of course that burns very, very fast. And they used a lot of that, and when they were using that, it would smoke something wicked, of course. And the smoke would go over into the pan, and when they got ready to have the syrup was just as black as a stove, and practically all you could see was just their eyes. Their faces were black too. Another sport that we had that worked well till we got the wrong man in the churn was we used to put somebody in a churn and churn them. And this churn was large enough so that a person could get right in it, and we'd close the door, and then there's two cranks. One on each side would crank it, and we'd whirl them in the churn. And when we had the large boy in there, it went fine because he could brace on each end. And that was my brother Phil. Well, of course, after we churned him, my younger brother wanted to be churned. We put him in there, and he wasn't large enough so that he could brace on each end. And as we'd go around, he went to hollering. And of course, they heard him at the house, and they put a stop to our churning. We were never able to do any more churning. This churn is about the size of a large barrel, and it's set on a bracket with handles on the sides to turn it. When brother and I were young, grandfather had turkeys, and he said, "Now you boys stay here till that old turkey goes on the nest, and after she has gone on, you can leave." So we stayed there quite a long time, and after a while the old turkey did go on the nest. And then at noon, they began to look for Elbridge and Philip, and they couldn't find us anywhere. Well, just about then, my father said he saw a hen go across the road, looked as if she's headed for the woods, and she was running something awful. And so they began to look around for the boys, and they found us down in the hen house. and I had fill at the hole so that the hens couldn't come out, and I had a stick, and I was driving the hens onto the nest. And they said in the nest there was a long nest of probably a dozen nests in with a roof over the top, and I had that truck full of hens that had rushed in there trying to get out of my way. Another job we had was the turkeys. The turkeys that were outside, we used to have to watch them when they went to the nest. And they'd go off into the woods, and most of the turkeys would rather cautious about going if they thought they were being watched. So we would have to stay back out of the way just so the old turkey couldn't see us. And if she'd keep working toward the nest, we'd keep following. And usually they'd be anywhere in the neighborhood of a tenth of a mile, a quarter of a mile away from the buildings, that they would find a nest. And we used to trail them to these nests. Another rather unusual thing that happened was I had two boys that were probably 4 or 5 years old, and they had been to church with their mother and seen a Negro there. And they were quite impressed by him, so they decided the next day perhaps they should be Negroes. And they found a barrel of waste oil, and they took a pail and they poured the waste oil all over the hair, right down so they were completely covered. And just as they were getting done, their uncle found them. And he couldn't bring them home in a vehicle because they were all oil, so he took one in each hand and brought them down to the mother. And he rather expected that she was going to be very upset. But they looked so funny that all she could do was laugh. When we used to go to school, we used to go with a horse. And in those days, the banks were perhaps not as high as they are now, but we used to take a long rope, and someone would either hang on to it, or we would hitch it to the sleigh, and the person would get on skis behind and ride the skis. And sometimes we used to get up over the bank, and so that we could be on the, while it wasn't so slippery. And of course, in those days, everyone had a good driving horse, and the horse, as we got a little careless with our driving, she'd start going faster. And if we didn't tend to our driving, sometimes she'd get running. And in one case, my brother fell down, and I don't know just why he didn't let go of the rope. Maybe we had it tied to him. But anyway, we dragged him a long ways with the horse running through the snow just flying.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pierce.